Some time ago, I feel it was about a year ago, I was asked if I might like to give a talk here, and I said, sure. What I'd especially like to talk about is the building that the New York Studio School is in, because it's a building that for as long as I've lived in New York, which is a very long time, not my entire life, I'm not a native, but I've been here for 36 or 37 years, I've lost count. This building has fascinated me. And once I started coming into the building some years ago and poking around, it fascinated me more and more. It's one of those buildings that the more I've looked at it, the more I've thought about it, the more it's fascinated me, and the more it's confused me. This is a very confusing building. As somebody said to me just before this evening's talk, there is probably the greatest number of staircases per square foot of building in this building than in any other in New York City, maybe the world. And I thought, okay, here's my opportunity to sort of focus on the building and make sense of it. I'm giving you a warning at the outset of the talk that I have utterly failed to do that. I have not made sense of the building, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. And I'm going to talk about it in sort of a contextual way. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the development of Mcdougal Alley as an artist's colony, because how this building became what it is not something that we can begin to understand until we begin to understand a little something about the development of Mcdougal Alley. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Her arrival in Mcdougal Alley in 1907 changed everything. I want to talk then a little bit about the artistic institutions that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and Juliana Force created and ran out of the buildings that became the Whitney Museum. Then I want to talk about the development of the Whitney Museum of American Art, a little bit about the architects of this building, the firm of Noel and Miller, particularly Auguste Noel, whose name you see on the screen, about whom, by the way, very little is known. Then I want to talk a little bit about this building in relation to other quirky, if I may use that word, New York buildings of its time, and then just a few sort of concluding remarks. It sounds like a lot, and it is, but we'll, I think, get through it in timely fashion. There she is. There's Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the very famous portrait of her by Robert Henry. I think of this as sort of her Truman Capote pose. And it really sort of, I think, says a lot about, if not who she was, at least who she wanted to be. Now here's a timeline, and I thought it would be a good idea to begin with this, so you have some sense of how these buildings came together. And when I say buildings, plural, in fact, what is today the building, singular, that we think of as the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, previously the Whitney Museum of American Art, was originally 8 buildings that were cobbled together, okay? So 1838 to 39, 3 buildings were built here on 8th Street, numbers 8, 10, and 12. Then in 1854, number 14 West 8th Street, and you'll be seeing pictures of these in just a little while, was built. So you have the 4 buildings, 4 houses on 8th Street. In 1900, and at some point, adjoining stables were built. It's hard for me to believe that those stables weren't built around the time the houses were built, but the best information that we have about when the stables were built indicate that they came later. I still think that they're probably older than we think they are. That said, there were 4 stables, one behind each of these 8th Street buildings, and those stables fronted on the mews that we call Mcdougal Alley, running directly behind 8th Street. So that's 8 buildings. In 1902, a sculptor named Frederick Tribell, a little bit more about him in a second, moved into one of those stables. And that sort of set off the whole process by which Mcdougal Alley developed into an artist's colony in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1906, an article in Craftsman magazine about Mcdougal Alley talked about how Daniel Chester French, James Earl Fraser, Philip Martini, Andrew O'Connor, and others all maintained their studios on Mcdougal Alley. Just in case you're not particularly knowledgeable about American sculpture at the turn of the 20th century, that is a who's who. I mean, everybody knows Daniel Chester French, right? James Earl Fraser did the Theodore Roosevelt equestrian statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History and was the teacher of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Philip Martini was, in my own opinion, the greatest architectural sculptor in America in his generation. Andrew O'Connor was one of the sculptors of the portal of St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue. I mean, these were major names, and they all had gravitated to this, dingy little stable mews in Greenwich Village. In 1907, they were joined by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. What happens when one of the richest women on the planet moves to a place like Mcdougal Alley? Well, the real estate becomes far more valuable, but that's a whole other lecture. 1912, Daniel Chester French purchased one of those houses on 8th Street and its adjoining stable, which today has the address of 17 Mcdougal Alley. 1913, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney bought the 8th Street house that adjoined her stable, which is numbered 19 Mcdougal Alley. 1914, 8 West 8th Street became something called the Whitney Studio, an exhibition space that was developed by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and particularly by the woman who had become her personal secretary, Juliana Force. 1918, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and Juliana Force opened the Whitney Studio Club, another of their artistic institutions, at 147 West 4th Street. And in that same year, Robert Chandler began his extraordinary design of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio located within 19 Mcdougal Alley. In 1923, Gertrude, forgive me if I address her familiarly, Gertrude leased 10 West 8th Street and its adjoining stable, and 8 and 10 together became the Whitney Studio Club, which moved in from 4th Street. 1925, Gertrude bought 14, or didn't buy, she actually, she bought 14 West 8th Street. 1929, Metropolitan Museum of Art rejected Gertrude and Juliana's offer of their collection. 1930, Gertrude bought 12 West 8th and its adjoining stable from Daniel Chester French, and now had all of the buildings that together, as we shall see, would be combined to form the first of the 4 locations in which the Whitney Museum of American Art has been based. 1942, Gertrude died. 1948, Juliana died 1954. The Whitney moved off of 8th Street to West 54th Street to a site adjoining the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art. And then in 1967, the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, one of America's premier art schools, opened in this complex of buildings. Here is Mcdougal Alley, today looking east toward number 2 Fifth Avenue, which was built in 1952. It's a picturesque stable muse, but just glancing at it, you would never imagine that it had the importance in the history of American art that it has. The stable that you see on the right, number 6 Mcdougal Alley, that's as you're facing into Mcdougal Alley from Mcdougal Street, it's the first stable on your right. That was the stable that was purchased in 1902 by a sculptor named Frederick Treibel. This is what it looks like today, all the way on the right. As you can see, it's been a little bit, spiffed up. But Treibel was a major, not really at the Daniel Chester French level, sort of the next level down major American sculptor in his time, got commissions like the Mississippi State Memorial in Vicksburg, the Beaux-Arts generation of American sculptors. But the thing about Treibel and Mcdougal Alley is that, so the story goes, one day he's recently returned to New York from some time abroad, is looking for a suitable studio, and hits upon the idea that one of these superannuated stables in Greenwich Village would be just the ticket. I say superannuated stables because these stables were built when an affluent population lived in this part of Greenwich Village. By the turn of the 20th century, fewer and fewer affluent people lived around here. And when they moved uptown, they took their horses and carriages with them. The people who remained down here, a distinctly poorer class, did not own horses and carriages. Consequently, these stables and carriage houses that abounded in this part of the city were, for the most part, empty. Some of them were used for this or that, but many of them were empty. And Treibel had the idea, if I put in a skylight, this is a perfect sculptor studio. Real estate people, the savvy ones, know that you follow the sculptors, not the painters. It's the sculptors who have the peculiar spatial needs. Thus, it was the sculptors who pioneered the stable studio, sculptors who pioneered the industrial loft studio, and so on. So follow the sculptors, everybody. Now, when all those other sculptors followed Treibel into Mcdougal Alley, and remember, only 4 years later, a major magazine, Craftsman, followed by other magazines, like House Beautiful, began to do articles about the studios and homes that the artists were creating in Mcdougal Alley. During that time, one of the pluses of the neighborhood was that directly across Mcdougal Street from Mcdougal Alley was Gonfarone's, which was everybody's favorite cheap and filling Southern Italian restaurant in New York. It was an enormously popular place among the artists of Greenwich Village, where they could really stuff themselves for a quarter in 1910. And then there's 19 Mcdougal Alley. Most of the artists who were living in Greenwich Village in this early 20th century period were far from well off. That's why they ate at places like Gonfarone's, and some of them couldn't even afford Gonfarone's. That wasn't the case with the woman who moved into 19 Mcdougal Alley. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, as I said, was one of the richest women in America. She was the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who was the grandson of Commodore Vanderbilt, whom we believe to be the third richest American who ever lived, somebody whose fortune in present-day terms would be maybe twice that of Bill Gates. So that gives you a sense. Here we see Gertrude in one of the many portraits of her done over the years, looking very different from the way she looks in the Robert Henright portrait. This is by John Everett Millais. Of course, you know, you're a Vanderbilt. Millais, you know, is going to do your portrait. This is in 1888. Gertrude was 13 years old. This is the house that Gertrude grew up in. This was located on 5th Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets, right where Bergdorf Goodman now is. This house had 137 rooms, the largest private house ever built in New York City. There's another picture of it. There are bits and pieces of this house all over the city. Gertrude herself preserved the entry gate to the house and donated it to the city of New York, where it's now the entry gate to the Conservatory Garden in Central Park, 5th Avenue and 105th Street. And that extraordinary fireplace by Augustus St. Gaudens that's in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was from Gertrude's girlhood home. This was their summer house. This was the Breakers in Newport. And this is what the dining room at the Breakers looked like. This is where they went in the summer to, you know, kick back and relax. So that is how Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney grew up. When she married a man who was just as rich as she was, Harry Payne Whitney. She felt that that was the only way, only by marrying a man as rich as she felt was the only way that she could feel confident that whoever married her wasn't marrying her for her money. Anyway, most of the time, Gertrude lived as everybody expected her to live. She and Harry Payne Whitney lived on an estate in Old Westbury, but Gertrude, you know, was a sculptor. And I just shot past, I'm sorry if I may go back. Gertrude was a very serious sculptor. There are a lot of people who don't particularly favor her works. I happen to really like a lot of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's sculpture. But whether you like it or not, she was deadly serious about it. She studied under James Earl Fraser and others, and when she took her studio on Mcdougal Alley, it was with the intention of producing her own work and, in addition to that, supporting the artists of Greenwich Village in what ways she could. Anyway, if you're looking for her work in public in New York City, there is that statue of Peter Stuyvesant in Stuyvesant Square, and there are other works of hers as well. So she had a studio constructed on the estate in Old Westbury. It was designed by the society architect, the very good society architects Delano and Aldrich. And it's rather different from 19 Mcdougal Alley. She maintained the two studios, the Delano Aldrich studio in Old Westbury and the one in Mcdougal Alley. In Old Westbury, this mural was done for her studio by an artist named Robert Winthrop Chandler. If you know your New York City family names, you know that Chandler is a real blue blood name. In fact, neither Vanderbilt nor Whitney is what we would call a blue blood name. Rich names, yes, but in terms of family lineage and so forth, Chandler sort of trumps both Vanderbilt and Whitney. But that said, they were, by this time, members of the same social set. He was one of the few artists whom she had regular dealings with who really could claim to be something like on her social level. Anyway, he did that mural for the Old Westbury studio, and then he also redesigned, beginning, as I said before, in 1918, the interior of her studio in the stable at 19 Mcdougal Alley, just steps from where we are right now. Robert Chandler was a bit of a nut. He was a wildly imaginative designer and decorator. Indeed, I don't really think there's anybody who was sort of getting the kinds of commissions that he was getting in his time, who was doing stuff that was more, how shall I put it, fanciful than what he was doing. And for Gertrude's studio, he, among other things, created this extraordinary fireplace and chimney, which is made out of plaster, and as you can see, is designed as tongues of flame rising to the ceiling. It's now painted white. We believe that originally it was not. But to my knowledge, I'm not sure we know what the original colors of it were, but even painted white, it's just a sight to behold. And as you can see, I have a number of photographs of it. The sculpture of the flames is Grammy. What a great idea for a fireplace, huh? And then as those flames rise up to the ceiling, they resolve into this very elaborate patterning in plaster that covers the ceiling, that features fanciful birds and beasts and sea creatures and dragons and flora and fauna of various kinds, which, again, you can see in this photograph and here and here. Now, her studio is a 2-story high space. Those are hay loft doors that you see at the top, and the entirety of the ceiling is covered by this fantastic bas-relief work by Robert Chandler. This is the outside, and this is the inside. Now, a little bit before that, Gertrude actually had another architect, a man named Grosvenor Atterbury, make some changes to her stable and to the adjoining house on 8th Street that had become the Whitney Studio, in order to connect Gertrude's studio on the alley with the office of Juliana Force, whom Gertrude put in charge of the Whitney Studio and all the subsequent institutions that the two women founded. Atterbury created this enclosed external staircase, which you can still see today, both outside and in. I mean, it's no great masterpiece or anything, but it is notable that it was done by Atterbury, who was one of the most important architects in New York's history, who, simultaneous with the work that he did on Gertrude's studio, was also designing Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, which is one of the most important works of its time. Now, switching back for a second to Robert Chandler, if you're interested in seeing more of the work that he did, there is his own home and studio at 147 East 19th Street. You can't, unfortunately, go in unless, I guess, you're friends of the owners. But on the outside, you can see the wonderful relief of giraffes over the doorway of Chandler's studio. And if you go to Miami, to a house called Vizcaya, which is just about the greatest house in America, you can see the swimming pool grotto that Robert Chandler created. As I say, his work did not fit into any sort of preconceived mold of the time. Really pretty wild stuff. There's Gertrude in a photograph by Edward Steichen. The date is in dispute. Some people think the photo is a little bit earlier, but however that may be, this is what she looked like in the 30s. Now, if you look at this real estate map, I have from 1904, I have arrows pointing to the houses on West 8th Street, which is on the far right edge. You see the arrow pointing to 14 West. That was the house that Daniel Chester French owned. Then an arrow pointing to 8 West, and in between them are 10 and 12. 19 Mcdougal Alley is directly behind 8 West 8th Street. If you remember back to the timeline that I began with, and I'm sure you memorized that, then you know that Gertrude and Juliana Force took over these houses with their adjoining stables gradually. When they first had 8 West 8th Street, they had the institution they called the Whitney Studio, and then with each additional property, the institution itself changed character slightly as it grew into more space. And eventually, they had the whole set of 8 separate buildings. Juliana Force is herself a very interesting character. If you want to learn more about her, the book Rebels on 8th Street by Avis Berman is the indispensable thing to read. This is a portrait of her back done by Guy Pendubois, and it's called Juliana Force at the Whitney Studio Club. Now, when this was done in 1921, the Whitney Studio Club was located on West 4th Street. It had not yet moved to 8th Street, as it soon would. And that's the 147 West 4th Street building that the Whitney Studio Club was in. It's still standing. But in 1923, it moved to 8th Street. And it was the immediate precursor of the Whitney Museum of American Art. The Whitney Studio Club was a place where artists could exhibit their work, but it was also a place where where artists could exhibit their work, but it was also a place where they could go and take classes and where they could socialize and so forth. Peggy Bacon shows a figure class called Whitney Studio Club Frenzied Effort. It's a dry point from 1925. And here's a lithograph by Mabel Dwight showing a life class at the Whitney Studio Club, 1931. And if you look pretty much in the center, you see a bald-headed man. That is Edward Hopper, who lived just a stone's throw away on Washington Mews. In 1923, which is the year that the Whitney Studio Club moved to 8th Street from 4th Street, the painter and photographer Charles Sheeler was actually given living quarters in the building and lived here for a year and a half. And during that time, one of the works that he did was a painting that he titled Mcdougal Alley. Now, when the Whitney Museum of American Art was created, it was the sort of culmination of this series of artistic institutions that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who had become the fairy godmother of the arts in Greenwich Village, and Juliana Force had created. But it wasn't created until Juliana Force had gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and spoken with its then director, Edward Robinson, and offered him the hundreds of paintings that she and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had acquired over the years. Basically, the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And as you all know, Edward Robinson said, sorry, not interested. And ever since, Edward Robinson has gone down as sort of one of the great heels in the history of art in New York. A little bit unfair maybe because Edward Robinson was the Met director who secured the bequests of J.P. Morgan, Benjamin Altman, and Henry and Louisine Havemeyer. That's not a bad resume. And who also hired the first woman curator at the Met, Gisela Richter. So not all bad, but he did turn down the offer, and that is when Gertrude and Juliana decided that they were going to transform their now 8 buildings on 8th Street and Mcdougal Alley into their own museum. And toward that end, they hired an architectural firm called Noel and Miller. And in a lot of the slides, I call them Miller and Noel. It was an accident, so I'm sorry. But Noel and Miller is a firm about whom people don't know very much. Auguste Louis Noel. Well, your first thought is, he must be French. But actually, he was born in Manhattan. But he was trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, worked for several years for a New York firm called Carrere and Hastings. More on that in a second. His partner, George McCulloch Miller, was the son-in-law of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. He was married to Flora Payne Whitney, Gertrude and Harry Payne Whitney's daughter. You know, that has always been and will always be the best career move an architect can make, is to marry into a stupendously wealthy family. And McCulloch Miller did just that. So no doubt it was because of Miller, who was known to family and friends as Cully, that that firm got the commission. Because Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney could have hired anybody. Why didn't she hire Delano and Aldrich, who had done the buildings at Old Westbury? They certainly could have done a great job. They were a great firm. Their buildings are all over New York, and there's not one that's bad. So she could have had them. She could have had any architect she wanted, but the family connection is no doubt what led them to Noel and Miller. Now, once they had Noel and Miller, it was down to Noel, not Miller, to design the house, to design the museum, excuse me. Why? Because Noel was the trained architect. Miller wasn't actually an architect at all. He was, however, a member of the firm, but all the designing was done by Noel. And what Noel did was he took 3 of the 4 houses on 8th Street, numbers 8, 10, and 12, and gave them the unified facade that they possess today. The 4th house, number 14, was left more or less as it was. It was an Italianate house from the 1850s that was originally built by a man named Alexander Walsh, who was neither here nor there, but the uncle of Henry James and William James. He built that as a house, lived there, and later on, the storefront was carved into the house. But a lot of original fabric is still visible on the facade of that house. And inside, it's connected with the other 3. So the thought naturally arises, why didn't everyone concerned place that unified facade across all 4 houses rather than only 3 of them? That's sort of like the first weird thing about this building. And one answer that has been suggested is that they wouldn't have been able to do a symmetrical facade had they done that. The entrance would have been very difficult to place in dead center, whereas with the three houses, that was a relatively easy thing. I don't know if that's a good answer or not. All we know is that they didn't stretch that facade across the four houses. Here we see a photograph of numbers 8 to 12. 1931 is when this photo was taken. Note the sidewalk. That was also part of Noel and Miller's design, and it remains to this day a notable feature of this building. There we see the entryway, and this is just, to me, so beautifully done, and I'll have more to say about this in a bit. The eagle, which is stretched, it's a beautiful eagle. It was done by a man named Carl Free, who was an artist, who was also the Whitney Museum's curator of watercolors, and who, in addition, designed stage scenery for Lincoln Kirstein's ballet Caravan, designed that eagle, and it is still there. As you can see, the sign has changed from Whitney Museum of American Art to New York Studio School, but there is Carl Free's. Carl Free, by the way, very short life. And here you see that entrance that Auguste Noel created. You have the two marble columns on either side of a doorway, which, by the way, is framed in a red marble. Then you have the eagle over that, and sort of framing the whole thing is this sort of fluted or reeded aluminum frame. And that aluminum pops up, as does that sort of fluting motif all over the facade of the building. And once you entered, this is Bernice Abbott's photograph of the entry foyer of the building. Once you entered, you had that beautiful curving stair, which is still there. This is pretty much as it originally was. And then as you proceed through, this is a look back towards the entrance of the original Whitney Museum of American Art. The rooms inside were not designed by Auguste Noel, but rather by an interior decorator who worked with Noel and Miller and other architects. His name was Bruce Buttfield, and not a great deal is known about him. We do know that he was, in the 1930s, associated with something that was called the Victorian Revival, which is interesting because we're all inclined to think that there was no such thing in the 1930s. But in fact, Buttfield, though he was very modern in spirit, liked to incorporate a lot of traditional stuff, very eclectically incorporate a lot of traditional stuff into his interiors. And his job at the Whitney Museum was to make the rooms, the galleries, appear as though they belonged to a private house. This was one of the homiest museums that was ever built in New York City. And you see it in picture after picture with the fireplaces and the moldings and the draperies and so forth. It really does look just extraordinarily homey. Now, what did critics think about it? Well, Lewis Mumford in the New Yorker. And by the way, in the 1930s, Lewis Mumford in the New Yorker liked nothing. Basically, he really liked nothing. He called the Whitney Museum a sort of fussy, modernistic interpretation of old American. The spread eagle wallpaper and the lighting fixtures at the entrance are irritating. One must take what comfort one can from the fact that its rakish little departures are at least a cut above the dull Georgian literalness of the new Museum of the City of New York. So that was the best that Lewis Mumford was able to say. But, you know, Lewis Mumford was wrong about most things. Great writer, by the way. I adore Lewis Mumford. So I don't mean to suggest otherwise when I say he was wrong about most things. In fact, I look at these pictures and I think that I was born too late, because I would have loved to have gone to the old Whitney Museum. There you see George Bellows's Dempsey and Firpo from 1924, one of the treasures that is owned by the Whitney. Now, upstairs on the 4th floor, and actually also on part of the 3rd, stretching across all 4 houses, each house is 25 feet wide, so this was 100 feet across, was the apartment of Juliana Force. Now, that's a nice perk of the job. Her apartment, huge, was also designed by Bruce Butfield. And as you can see, it has, like the rest of the museum, a lot of very homey touches, a lot of traditional furniture, also a lot of art on the walls, and also a lot of American folk art, which was a particular passion of Juliana Force. Now, I was very excited when recently I found some photographs of Bruce Butfield's own apartment, which was right across the street. So maybe that's how he got the job. I don't know, but his apartment seems to be very similar to Juliana Force's. It was at 21 West 8th Street, as I say, right across the street. There is that wallpaper that Lewis Mumford found irritating with the eagles. And in 1954, the Whitney moved to 54th Street, to a site, as I said before, adjoining the sculpture garden of MoMA. And there's the facade, 1954. That's what buildings looked like. And who designed it? Noel and Miller were the architects of the new Whitney. But like everyone else, they had sort of gone more mainstream modern. And there was an eagle, which was designed by Louis Iceland. Not the same as the eagle at the old Whitney. It's a new eagle, and indeed, if you look up Auguste Louis Noel's grave, which is in Merrimack County, New Hampshire, it reproduces Louis Iceland's eagle. Why not Carl Free's eagle? Carl Free's eagle is a better eagle, but it's Louis Iceland's eagle that adorns the grave of Auguste Noel. Now, what about Noel and Miller? Did they design anything else? Indeed, they did. Now, I looked them up in New York City Department of Building Records to see what else in Manhattan they designed. Not a lot. They might have done, remodeling, so I didn't look for them in alteration records, just new building records. But they did Good Shepherd School, which is way up in Upper Manhattan. It's, and they did an apartment building on East 86th Street, which is, again, but where they really seemed to shine was in their country houses. This is a house which outwardly is very modest. It's in Locust Valley. It was done for a man named William Armstrong Greer. And boy, this is a really delightful house. You can see the stair and the column, a beautiful mantelpiece which they designed. You can see the detail. There's painted decoration by Violet Twachtman in this house. She was the daughter of John Henry Twachtman. Some more of that. So it's a very nice house. Noel and Miller designed rock fields for James Stillman Rockefeller, so Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney wasn't their only, client in the 400. This is in Greenwich. And as you can see, it's pretty standard, but it has that beautiful curving stair, and it really seems to me to have a whole lot in common with the entry foyer stair here, almost as though the one here is a slightly reduced version of the one there. They also designed here just a bunch of weird things, the Hitchcock Memorial Clinic in Aiken, South Carolina, Bailey's Beach in Newport in 1939, and their swan song right before Noel dies. Last building that he designed, the last building, every architect's last building is something truly weird. And in this case, the Sudan Pavilion. Who even knew there was a Sudan Pavilion at the New York World's Fair? But there was, and you look at it, and oh my God, what a building this is. I mean, just look at that sort of Georgian cupola, you know, on top of this thing that otherwise looks like a sort of cut-rate version of an Edward Durell Stone embassy. I would have loved to have seen it. But that was Auguste Noel's last building. Now, Auguste Noel, as I told you, worked for Carrere and Hastings. If you read Noel's obituary, which appeared in the New York Times, it's very short. And it says he started his career with Carrere and Hastings. However, if you look at that massive 2-volume monograph on Carrere and Hastings that was published by Acanthus Press a few years ago, there is in that work an appendix that lists all the employees of Carrere and Hastings and when they worked for the firm. Sure enough, there under N is Auguste Louis Noel. And the dates that it gives are 1923 to 1929, which means, if that's correct, and there's no reason to think that it is not, if it is correct, it means that the firm of Noel and Miller existed before Noel went to work for Carrere and Hastings, and then was reconstituted after Noel left Carrere and Hastings. In other words, he did not start out with Carrere and Hastings. He went to work for Carrere and Hastings later on in his professional career. And in fact, I can find no buildings by Noel and Miller for the years that he is said to have worked for Carrere and Hastings. I found buildings before that, buildings after that, but not during that. And if he was there then, that also means that he was at Carrere and Hastings with William Lamb and Richmond Shreve, who later would form a firm called Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, which designed the Empire State Building. And it occurs to me that there is more than a little of the Empire State Building in this building. Now, that might sound very strange to you at first, but look at the design of the front of the Empire State Building. Look at those two fluted pilasters on either side of the entrance, and they are similar to the columns that are on the front here. Look at the eagles that top those pilasters, and you have the eagle over the entrance here. Look at the way that the upper windows of the Empire State Building have aluminum frames, and then look at the way that Noel used an aluminum frames in this building. You can see the way that the windows have frames of red metal, and the inner frame of the doorway here is red marble with very similar effect. Now, the New York Studio School was, the Whitney Museum of American Art was designed by Noel right after the Empire State Building had been designed, but before the Empire State Building had been built. And so I'm thinking that Noel probably knew William Lamb and or Richmond Shreve. He had worked with them, so he knew them. This we know. But was he privy to the designs of the Empire State Building before ground was broken for the building? I suspect he was, because I think that these are striking similarities between the two buildings. Now, some other buildings that were built around the same time that I think have some of the same quirky quality as this building. Victor Maper, who was one of the first architects in America to base his practice on international style modernism, designed this sort of quirkily classical building on East 7th Street for the Hebrew Actors Union, kind of that modernistic traditionalism that Lewis Mumford hated. Similarly, in post offices of the 1930s, you find a lot of the same spirit that's in this building. Thomas Harlan Elliot's Bronx Central Post Office on the Grand Concourse. This by William Dewey Foster, an architect who was also an architectural historian, and like Noel in this building, taking his very traditional training and using it toward rather imaginative ends, not anything that is correctly classical, but in something that nonetheless is a kind of modern classical. The same with Lorimer Rich's Madison Square Post Office. I think that this is sort of a beguiling group of buildings, of which this one is my favorite. This is what it looked like back in the 1970s, but you know, everything looked like this back in the 1970s. I just couldn't help showing this picture. It just sort of, you know, for all of you people who are nostalgic. And neither here nor there, but just in case anyone was wondering when that weird little strip mall next door to here was built with, you know, Domino's Pizza, 1963. And here you see that the entry foyer to what is today and has since 1967 been the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture is largely unchanged. The John Gregory sculptures that were originally in those niches aren't there anymore, but nonetheless the stair railing is exactly the same, and there you see it. Today, the New York Studio School occupies what is basically the same warren of spaces that was occupied by the Whitney Museum of American Art. I'm not going to go over these floor plans much because I thought having the floor plans to this building, which I was so excited to get, would really help me understand the building better, and they did not. In fact, they just confused me more. But that said, you can see that it's on the second floor that in the front on 8th Street was what was originally Juliana Force's office, and it was connected via that stair to Gertrude Vanderbilt, to what was the Whitney Studio in the back. And recently, for a very brief period of time, the New York Studio School sign came down and revealed the old Whitney Museum sign. It was one of those moments when every New Yorker who's interested in this kind of thing, which is like 8 people, got on the subway and came here and took pictures. But there it is, the original Whitney Museum of American Art, which has maintained its status as one of the great artistic institutions of New York by housing the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture. That's it. Thank you very much.